And for our last talk this evening, we have Matthew Staab from UC Davis. And he's going to talk about probing Fermi surface degeneracies in lanthanum nickel gallium 2 with photoemission.
All right, can you hear me?
Sure, yeah.
Great. So thank you to the organizers for inviting me for this. And my name is Matthew Staab. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis. Today I'm going to talk about probing Fermi surface degeneracies in lanthanum nickel gallium 2. So this material is a very interesting and unusual superconductor. At this superconducting temperature of 2 Kelvin, it also has a sharp increase of what is called the muon spin relaxation signal. And this essentially says that the superconducting state has a magnetic field associated with it. And that implies that the superconducting state itself breaks time reversal symmetry. And that's very unusual because sort of BCS superconductivity relies heavily on time reversal symmetry. So this is obviously a non-BCS superconductor. There's been a couple of different papers about sort of theoretical models of this, and they all sort of converged on the idea that this needs to have 2 bands and 2 gaps contributing to the superconductivity. So here, this plot is the temperature relative to the superconducting temperature versus the superfluid density. And the only thing I want you to remember out of this is that the gamma model fits well to the data, while these sort of other single band, single gap models do not fit well. So because superconductivity relies on these low energy excitations, Fermi surface crossings are a natural platform for these sort of 2 band models. And my experiments don't directly probe the superconducting state, but there's a lot of examples where we can learn a lot about the superconducting state based off of the normal state of a compound. And so here's one example of that. On the x-axis, we have electrical conductivity, and the y-axis, we have the superconducting transition temperature. And you can see that the worse of a conductor a material is, the more likely it is to be a better superconductor. And that's a little counterintuitive. Why would a material be a better superconductor if it is a bad conductor? Well, as it turns out, the same mechanism that causes the poor conductivity at room temperature, namely like the phonons, contributes to the pairing mechanism of the electrons in the superconductivity. And so this is just one example of normal state helping us understand the superconducting state. So I'm going to be trying to probe those Fermi surface degeneracies, and the method I use is called angle resolved photoemission spectroscopy. This is based off of the photoelectric effect that Einstein won his Nobel Prize off of. So on the right, I have a picture of the UC Davis ARPA's lab, and I'll explain the process. So first, we put our crystal into the chamber. We generate some high energy light, usually UV or X-ray light. We shine that light onto our crystal, which through the photoelectric effect emits photoelectrons, and these electrons are then analyzed by some complicated electronics to get the angle of emission and kinetic energy that they're emitted with. Now, based on the conservation of energy and momentum, we can turn the angle of emission and kinetic energy that we measure into the crystal momentum and binding energy that the electrons had when they lived in the crystal. And this helps us almost directly measure band structure of material. So this is one example image on the left, and these high intensity regions, the color scales on the right here, these high intensity regions are essentially where a band is, and the lower intensity region is where a band is probably not. And up near the top here, you see the sharp drop in intensity because we're only measuring the occupied states. So this is the Fermi level. Now, we can also change the photon energy that we're using to measure, and that allows us to probe the perpendicular component of momentum. So ARPAs in total, when you tune all of the different parameters, can measure the full 4-dimensional energy momentum landscape of electronic structure. Now, here's a DFT calculation of the Fermi surface of lanthanum nickel gallium 2, and it's very busy, so I'll go through it a little slowly. In the middle, we have Fermi Surface 1, which is sort of just centered in the zone and won't have much of an effect on this talk. Fermi Surface 2 and 3 go nearly all the way around the Brillouin zone, and they form a degenerate loop at this purple loop here along this zone boundary. Likewise, Fermi Surface 4 and 5 form these concentric cylinders around the edges of the Brillouin zone, and those form degenerate lines along the same zone boundary. So we've dubbed this the nodal plane of lanthanum nickel gallium 2, and that's the plane that I want to access using ARPAs. So this is the first ARPAs measurement done on lanthanum nickel gallium 2, and because of that, we need to first do some photon energy dependence to sort of orient experimentally in the Brillouin zone. So because of the shape of these crystals being a platelet style shape, the photon energy dependence, the way I've mounted the crystal, will vary up and down in this picture. So if I take a spectrum, which would be a line through the Brillouin zone and an image in energy and momentum space, this line here will correspond to the integration of these two lines here near the Fermi energy. Now I could repeat this process at many different photon energies and integrate near the Fermi energy for all of those cuts and form a sort of two-dimensional slice through the Brillouin zone experimentally. And if I do that, that's down here on the right, I can compare that to the DFT calculations on the left, and comparing the two, I can see that a photon energy of about 144 eV corresponds to the center of the Brillouin zone. And so the rest of the experiments that I'm going to talk about are done at that photon energy, sort of through the center of the Brillouin zone. Now that we've oriented ourselves in the center, we can scan the two different angles out of the surface and measure the Fermi surface cut in a different direction. So again, I'm looking for these degeneracies on the nodal plane here, which corresponds to the top wall and the bottom wall here. And just qualitatively from looking at this picture, you can see they come to quite a sharp meeting point, but we can make that more quantitative by looking at the individual spectra. So again, here's the same image on the left, and I've overlaid the DFT calculations on top of the ARPAs now. And this green line at the zone boundary corresponds to this green line on this spectrum near the Fermi energy. And you can see in this image, there's a very sharp crossing of the Fermi energy by this band that originates from two bands here. Now, I can plot the intensity along the momentum here as well. It's known as a momentum distribution curve. And if I do that, I can fit a single Gaussian background as well as a single Lorentzian peak. And the peak width I obtain here is actually it ended up being the resolution of the experiment. So it's a resolution limited peak. Now, I can repeat this same sort of process for the cuts that are in blue and red here, just inside and outside the zone respectively. And you can see that just inside the zone, it's much more broad, and just outside the zone, you can see a clear two peaks. So I can fit those as well using the same fixed fitting parameter to sort of give it its best shot. And you can see a clear separation of two peaks in both the cases, inside and outside the zone. One more quantitative agreement we can do is overlaying the DFT on the actual spectra. So it's common in ARPAs not to see every band expected in DFT, but it's not very common to see a band and it not be there. So the bands we do observe correspond to sort of this green and red dashed line pair in all three cases. And you can see in the middle panel here, the green and red lines are basically on top of each other, and the calculated splitting at the Fermi energy is about 0.02 inverse angstroms, where again, my resolution was much broader than that. It's about 0.09 inverse angstroms. And so the peak we measured was about as thin as it could be. And so this is very good quantitative evidence that there is actually a band degeneracy at the Fermi surface at those zone boundaries. Now, I would also so that was the conclusion for the main points, but now this is a sort of a future work where I want to access the nodal plane directly and be able to sort of do a nice image similar to this left image here of the nodal plane. And that's only possible if I can actually cleave the crystal on its thin edge instead of on the flat edge. And this is a very technologically challenging problem to do. It's hard to mount these crystals this way. And thanks to how small beam spot size the synchrotrons nowadays have, I can actually make a measurement like this. And so this is just a proof of concept that I've repeated this region of the Rowan zone using a photon energy dependence instead of angle dependence, and see similar features. So this is ongoing work that I have beam time coming up for that I'm very excited about getting more nice spectra at this cleaved edge. So the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit more of a broad topic, and that's visualizing multidimensional data. So ARPES has two common ways that these three-dimensional data sets can be seen. One is stacking up images on top of each other like this and allowing the reader to sort of interpolate between. The other is to sort of paste images along the side of a three-dimensional object. And these are all well and good, and they have their own space. This is what the sort of pasting of a three-dimensional object would look like for my lantern of data. These are all good, but have their own limitations because you can't really tell what's going on in between the images or inside of the three-dimensional object. So I've been working on a program to essentially simulate the photoemission intensity as a density of a cloud that is then rendered sort of using Rayleigh scattering, like a cloud in the sky. And so if I do that for the lantern data on the right here, you see this image on the right. And this is still work in progress. I've only been able to plot this about 2 months ago, right before the winter break. But yeah, you can see it. You can very well visualize these sort of cylindrical features around the corner of the zone. And you can even tell that there is something going on the inside of the zone. And that is actually what originates Fermi Surface 1 that I said I wasn't talking about much in this talk. Yeah, so with that, I'd like to thank my PI, Ina Vishik, the sample collaborators, Jackson and Valentin Talfour, the theory calculations, and my synchrotron beam scientist. Are there any questions?
Okay. Okay, questions? Well, let me begin by asking which parts of the measurement were done at UC Davis and which parts were done at the beamline?
Actually, all of the data that I showed today was done at the beamline. Our ARPES lab in Davis is very, very sort of new, and there's a lot of tuning that needs to be done. But the photon energy dependence is only available at a synchrotron. Home-based labs can't do that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Any further questions? You have the misfortune of being at the very end of the day when everyone is exhausted, but it was a great talk, Matthew. And I won't twist the arm of the audience for one last question. Let me thank you one last time for being very patient and giving us the talk at the very end of the day. It was a great talk.